Welcome to the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, Culture Editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're bringing videos of all of these podcasts, putting them up on YouTube, and you can check back there every single day. I'm here right now with my colleague, Kylee Zempel, Assistant Editor at The Federalist. We're going to break down the mess of the debate that occurred just last night. Kylee, what were your impressions of the matchup between Trump and Biden?
It was kind of hard to tell. It so quickly turned from a matchup between Trump and Biden to a 2-on-1, where it seemed like Trump was trying to fend off both Joe Biden and Chris Wallace. As far as just the two actual contenders, though, they didn't really come out very calm. I mean, it was a lot of interruptions right out of the gate. Chris Wallace lost control almost immediately, and they really just got off topic. I think on the very first question, it was about the Supreme Court, and all of a sudden they were talking about healthcare and other things, and it was like, it was really hard to have like a productive conversation, it seemed, because they just so quickly derailed. And the debate obviously was just largely unproductive, I think.
Well, and a normal year when substance is, something that actually matters in a presidential debate, Joe Biden's answer to that first question would be really damning for him, because he openly refused to answer whether he would entertain the notion of court packing, and with this excuse that whatever my answer is, it'll become the storyline. And he is absolutely right. If he doesn't support court packing, the far left that he needs to turn out will publicize that he's not a true leftist and could possibly depress the vote in areas where he needs turnout. And if he says yes, well, that's crazy. And so that's right. An entirely different cycle. Well, if Joe Biden wants to say he's Mr. Decency and Courage and Integrity, he should have the decency and courage and integrity to tell people where he stands on this issue, because it's extremely important. But Kylee, substance did not matter much in this debate, because whenever there was an opportunity for it to be discussed, the other candidate or the moderator, everything went off the rails.
That's right. Well, and you make a good point about...
as usual.
As always, all Emily's points are good.
That's true.
Yeah, about... the media using whatever, not the media would defend Biden, but just Biden either coming off as, giving up on the far left or on moderates based on however he would answer a question, such as Supreme Court packing. One of the most interesting things was seeing how Trump really took every opportunity possible to always call out Joe Biden every time he alienated the left, whether it was about the Green New Deal, climate change things, whether it was about Supreme Court issues, whatever it was, law and order. Trump was calling him out for not being able to say law enforcement, because the far left would not
say law and order. Right.
Yep. Because the far left would abandon him, and the same with these other issues. And that was, I think, a strong point for Trump last night. But that was most obvious with the Supreme Court question.
Right. I think Trump definitely came prepared to try and corner Biden. And again, he did that successfully a couple of times when Biden either sort of tepidly went against the far left that kind of runs his party now, or when he, was openly suggesting something radical, or also just kind of alluding to it or being suggestive of it. But at the same time, I don't actually think that made a difference for anybody, because I think this was a cacophony. I think the debate was ultimately a cacophony. I think that's probably true for people who are watching and are among the slim proportion of voters who remain undecided. It's slim, but it's an important voting block, because this is likely to be a close election like what we saw in 2016, particularly when it comes down to the Electoral College. I think, if anything, that debate made people less likely to vote.
Well, I would say, that the number of people who are undecided who they're voting for, whether it's between Trump and Biden, is much smaller, if it exists at all, than the number of people who are just undecided whether they're voting or not.
Right.
And, that could have been swayed a bit by this debate.
Yeah, and we talk about voters a lot in the political arena and in the media arena, but we actually oftentimes lose sight of the fact that there are potential voters that are a really important demographic, especially, you could talk to Hillary Clinton about that in 2016, and you could talk to the Trump campaign about that in 2016. The Trump campaign turned out potential voters who may have sat out other elections and were disillusioned with the political process. I think if people are disillusioned with the political process, they were probably disillusioned with the debate that they saw on Tuesday. And that's really important because to me, as I was watching this, I was disillusioned. And this is, of course, my job as it's your job. I really see this debate as a symptom of a much deeper and a much deeper disease. The debate was a symptom of a disease that goes deeper than our politics and goes into our culture. And I think one thing that the political media often loses sight of, and I'm saying this as culture editor of the Federalist, is the culture. And they lose sight of the various trends that, they try to understand it. And there was so much conversation about this in 2016. Suddenly everyone was interested in figuring out why these Obama voters flipped to Donald Trump. And that's a cultural question as much as it's a political one. But I don't think that anyone in the corporate media as a whole has really done the legwork to answer that question in a meaningful way in those 4 years. And I think we've just seen our culture accelerate in terms of decay. And I think, you can question me on this. I think that's why we saw these septuagenarians last night sort of shouting at each other without coming to any serious solutions or very clear contrast.
Right. Well, there were also no significant cultural discussions.
Mm-hmm. No Roe v. Wade question.
No Roe v. Wade question.
Which I believe was promised.
I believe so. I believe it was promised, and also it just seemed like an obvious topic to bring up by Joe Biden. If that's your talking point and that's what you're most worried about on the Supreme Court, why aren't you attacking Trump with that? Mm-hmm. But there really were no substantive cultural questions, which makes you just have to look at what actually happened instead of the topics that were discussed to diagnose what's happening in culture. And not only can you infer it from the discourse and the way that Trump and Biden interacted, but you also have the huge media component, right? Which just cannot be understated from the debate last night. And that's a huge problem that's poisoning our culture.
Now, tell me more about that. What do you mean in terms of when we're speaking about the context of the debate last night? What do you mean?
So, of course, it's typical that the media is spending, the media is against Trump as a general rule. Right. And so you expect that. We've seen it in past debates where moderators will sort of, throw softball questions to the Democratic candidate and then, really hammer down on the Republican. And of course, there were times last night where, Trump did tend to interrupt more than Biden. And so it made sense that he would be cut off more often.
I was going to say, I thought the interruption was tactically unwise.
Tactically unwise
on Trump's end. Yeah. And I think, right. I think it did not come across well.
No, I don't think it did either.
Petulant.
Right. I agree. But not all of the counter interruptions from Wallace were because of Trump interrupting. Yes. And I think that's a really important point because the media will try to play it off as if that was the case, that Trump just would not shut up. And so therefore Chris Wallace had to continue stepping in when that did happen sometimes. But what you continued to see was Chris Wallace running cover for Joe Biden when he either didn't have answers to questions, when he needed help with his own policy positions, essentially engaging in specific policy debates with the president, and then feeding Biden his own lines, essentially.
Well, and you have a piece up on the Federalist about this right now, correct?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And what's that piece called?
Oh, what is it called?
Something about Chris
Wallace is the most embarrassing moderator in history. Yeah, something to that effect. It's a big headline. It's and I think you explain the reasons why, you substantiate the reasons why you think that's the case, and some of them you've said. Chris Wallace was in an impossible position either way, but
even so, you argue that his interruptions were still sort of biased in one direction and not the other.
Right, because they weren't just interrupting, they weren't just cutting the candidates off. It was the way that he interacted with each of them. You saw Chris Wallace, letting Biden just kind of like not fact checking him at all about, say, the Hunter Biden situation, which even just this week, more news came out, a Senate report, I believe, and so Joe Biden is up there saying, that's simply not true, that his son received $3.5 million from, the ex-mayor of Moscow's wife.
The ex-mayor of Moscow's wife, second cousin's dogs. Yeah.
And so Chris Wallace just lets that slide. And then, Trump is answering questions about his tax return. And Chris Wallace doubles down and asks the same question multiple times, even though Trump has already answered it. Or, fighting him basically on climate change and trying to paint him, as a science denier or whatever it might be. And I think one thing that was really telling is that you didn't just have conservative media attacking Chris Wallace. You had Chris Wallace's own colleagues making comments about him, and also even leftist journalists saying, this is a disgrace, this is a mess, where's the moderator?
Yeah, and again, this is an impossible position. I wonder, it almost seemed like there was a level of surprise that the debate was so acrimonious and that the debate was such a mess, when I think that's really what you had to expect. Right. There's just... Even the debates between Trump and Hillary Clinton, where Hillary Clinton tried to, she wasn't calling him a clown like Biden, or saying, just shut up, man, just shut up.
Right.
Even those debates weren't on the level of what we saw last night. And that, part of that you just have to expect when you have these two, frankly, male sort of brash, big egos in a room together, debating for the presidency, the leadership of the free world. You had to expect fireworks like this, and really should have been prepared with a strategy that was, I think, a little bit clearer than just sort of interrupting when it... Do you know what I mean?
Right.
I don't even know what the strategy was, but there was definitely a strategy that said interrupt it, when I actually think it would have been more productive to let them sort of guide the conversation themselves.
Right, which they tried to do at several points, and then got reined back in, usually when Trump was about to make an important point or was in the middle of making, fact-checking Biden in real time or whatever it might be. One thing that you have to wonder, though, is what were Trump and Biden's objective, and did they accomplish it, in that debate style? I don't know that you could say who the clear winner was. I think people were surprised that Biden was able to hold his own and string complete sentences together and not just be, a mess of gaffes the whole night, that it was largely coherent. And I think Trump's tactic was largely unsurprising, but did they accomplish the optics that they wanted to?
Definitely Trump did not. I think Biden's goal was really to get through this debate without getting totally bulldozed. And remember, these debates are not they are not going to influence a huge swath of voters, but they are likely going to influence a slim proportion of voters who may matter in swing states. So I think Biden's goal was sort of just to get through this without being bulldozed and, staying on message, all of that. And, he had moments where he said, shut up, man, and called Trump a clown. But Trump, on the other hand, when he, for instance, interrupted the conversation about Hunter or about Beau to ask if Biden was talking about Hunter, that was a cringe-inducing moment. And on top of all of this, the media cards are stacked against Trump. So he has much less room for error. And I think, Biden and Trump were both petulant. And this is really my big takeaway from the night. And we can get into this in a second. But I think, a poor debate performance ultimately is worse for Trump than it is for Biden. There's a side of Trump that in debates, especially 2015 and 16, we were talking about this just yesterday on the YouTube channel about how I said he's, quote, an amazing debater. That's my exact quote. And there's no way around that. 2015 and 16, he bulldozed a really impressive, strong primary field of Republican candidates, largely because of his performance at the debates. And I wonder if there's something about this moment in our history right now where things feel so dark and you have a pandemic a economy that's left a lot of people struggling for work and struggling to pay their bills. And on top of that, race riots. I wonder if there's something that sort of takes the wind out of his sails, because in those debates, he was able to be kind of funny in a way that we didn't see last night. Even on serious topics, he was able to be dismissive, and that just did not come across last night.
Right. So there were a couple of times where he had a couple of zinger one-liners that I think took the place of his normal humor.
You'd be in jail. That's my favorite 2016
You'd be in jail. Yeah. I really appreciated the I've done more in 47 months than you have in 47 years.
That's his best line of attack in debates. And we talked about that yesterday. That is the 47 years thing is his biggest talking point in a debate setting, because that's what the swing voters don't want to put another person from the political establishment in there. And when Trump says 47 years, that's a strong talking point.
Right. Especially when all of these policy platforms are things that lawmakers should be doing, not the executive. Biden spent his fair share of time in the Senate and wasn't able to, get any of these laws passed except for the 94 crime bill, which he also got attacked for last night by Trump.
Violence against women Act.
Right. Yeah. So you did have a couple of those moments where Trump had a few zingers. But then there were a couple of moments where, and maybe this is just me being soft, but where you kind of saw a human moment from Trump. One that really stuck out to me was when Chris Wallace made the comment about the very fine people in Charlottesville, and was basically legitimizing a leftist talking point that has been debunked about Trump's supposedly racist comments regarding white supremacists and neo-Nazis during riots in Charlottesville. And Trump just kind of hung his head and was like, that's not true. And he wasn't fighting it. It wasn't him actively interrupting. It was kind of like a saying it to himself moment at the podium. And there were a few of those, as you kind of saw Chris Wallace and Joe Biden teaming up on him. And that was an interesting side of Trump that you don't often see from him.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think there was another Charlottesville moment last night. And, I am still not a fan of how Trump handled the Charlottesville question. And I think that's back in, I think it was 2017. And I think we had a similar moment last night where Trump fumbled a question on race, I think largely because he doesn't speak like a normal politician, and he's so hostile to those questions because they're not asked in the same way to Democrats. That was demonstrated when Biden got a little bit more of a softball question about Antifa. But I think he fumbled the question when he was asked, and by the way, I'm saying this right now, I've been taking insane heat for my position on this, but the media a bunch of major corporate media outlets ran headlines saying Donald Trump refused to condemn white supremacy. Van Jones on CNN, his takeaways from the debate, Donald Trump refused to condemn white supremacy. He said it a couple of times. Donald Trump was asked by Chris Wallace if he was, quote, willing to condemn white supremacists and militias. And Donald Trump responded, right as Chris Wallace said that, in the middle of Wallace's sentence, sure. He said, sure. And then later he said, I'm prepared to do that, just a couple of seconds later. And then in their conversation, again, a couple of seconds later, Trump said, name somebody, tell me who I'm supposed to condemn, in kind of a tone that's like, yeah, I'll do it. Of course, give me a name, and he's right to ask for a name, because the SPLC, like the Southern Poverty Law Center and these other groups that are supposedly tracking white supremacy and hate groups, put any conservative organization, Family Research Council, whomever it is, if they, for instance, defend traditional marriage or whatever, they're bigoted groups that go on a hate list. So Donald Trump is right to ask for a name, but when Joe Biden, not Chris Wallace, Joe Biden said, Proud Boys, Trump said, I believe his words were, stand back and stand by. Again, Trump says these things because he's not a normal politician, and he speaks more casually, and he doesn't care that what he says is going to be a PR headache for his campaign and for the White House. And that's how you get these sound bites. I don't think he handled that question well. I think your blanket answer is always, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But the media was disgraceful in the way they covered this, and disgraceful. I'm not so like I'm mostly upset that they misinformed literally millions of readers. Think of all the people that only look at the headlines. There were so many headlines that said Trump, quote, refused to condemn white supremacy. The second part of that question, he should have been clearer, but he literally said, sure. And if you want to split hairs between whether saying you're willing to condemn white supremacy and saying, yes, I condemn white supremacy, if you think there's some hugely meaningful distinction between those two things, you're welcome to make that argument. I'll tell you that it's ridiculous hair splitting. But that, right. So I think we have another situation like that where both sides, like Trump fumbles a question, he doesn't answer it as he could, like it's not the best answer. And the media gives just absolutely pathetic coverage of it, and so it's just one of these things where it's like it's such a circus, because the conversation that we've been having all day today is that Donald Trump did not condemn white supremacy, which is flat out ridiculous.
Right. Well, and Joe Biden, mentioned Proud Boys specifically, but when Donald Trump replied, what is it? Stand back and stand by. Yep. Was that his quote? You have to take that in context of what Chris Wallace had said immediately before Joe Biden said Proud Boys, which was, I forget who he said, white supremacists or racist?
White supremacists and militias.
And he said, will you tell white supremacists and militias to stand down? Yep. Chris Wallace's words were stand down. And then when Joe Biden jumped in and said Proud Boys, Donald Trump is listening to Chris Wallace. He's listening to Joe Biden. Pair that with the fact that he fumbles things and just like talks really off the cuff. And he just says Proud Boys. And then he kind of pauses and he goes, stand back and stand by. Yeah, and it was like, it was very clearly in context a response to Chris Wallace's comment to stand down. And if you take that out of the equation, it doesn't even make sense for Trump to respond, stand back and stand by. Like, what does stand by mean following stand back if it doesn't mean stand down? I mean, it's like, it was just a mess of an exchange, and the media has completely spun it to make Trump look like a racist. And it's been just absolutely egregious. And also, when Trump is trying to figure out how to answer these questions, like when he says, you make a good point about trying to discern who exactly do you want me to condemn? Yeah. So, follow-up questions, then it's all part of a broader attempt to trap Trump with these, lefty questions. Like later on when Chris Wallace characterized critical race theory as racial sensitivity trainings, I believe. And then Trump responded, why did I ban those in the federal government? Because they're racist, which was an accurate statement. And then Chris Wallace follows that up with, what's so wrong about racial insensitivity trainings? And it's like all of these really, kind of gross questions that are meant to trip Trump up into saying something that can be misconstrued as racist. And to me, that's not very different from the will you condemn white supremacist comment. It's all Trump taking it in and trying not to misstep by saying something that can be misconstrued. And it doesn't matter because it all will be.
So this brings me to the larger point, which is what I really wanted to talk about in terms of this debate, which is that Trump and Biden are both symptoms of much deeper problems. So I don't think a lot of people in the Beltway actually understand the extent to which Donald Trump won the Electoral College and won, frankly, the Republican primary because he points out media corruption. That in and of itself is one of the biggest planks of his platform. And so people in politics, this is why they don't understand Joe Rogan, but people in politics tend to think of people in terms of their actual platforms that you might see on their website, right? Trump was elected because of trade. Trump was elected because of immigration. Well, yes, those things
the
are
Green
true.
New Deal and Biden supporting the Green New Deal.
Right. But that, so exactly, right. So that's how people see Trump. That's the prism through which people see Trump, or they'll see him through racism and misogyny, either way. But really, yes, it's true that people in some Obama voters in those Rust Belt states, those swing states, your Wisconsin, your Michigan, your Pennsylvania, it is true that they liked what he was saying about immigration and trade, but it's also that they liked his attitude when he was talking about immigration and trade, and when he was talking about the media, and when he was talking about political correctness. So the reason that Donald Trump right now was the Republican nominee and is currently the president of the United States is because the media and other institutions, Wall Street, Street, Washington, Hollywood have failed the public to the extent that people were willing to thrust the host of the Celebrity Apprentice into the Oval Office. That's no small part of this.
Right.
This is huge. And Joe Biden, and I mean, if you have to think about this honestly on a personality level, and I really mean this, and it applies to Trump as well, although I think it's different. But like, Biden is, how old is he? 70, 77, 76?
Something like that.
Okay, so the man is in his mid to late 70s, and he's had a successful career. He has a family. Why on earth do you want to be president of the United States? Do I think Joe Biden wants to be president of the United States because he genuinely thinks that he is the best person or he genuinely thinks, he wants to make all of these positive changes and no, I think maybe he rationalizes it that way. But if you're that age and you're not on a beach in Florida or volunteering at your church, you are like, there's an egomaniacal component of it. And the reason that we have these two people in this situation is Joe Biden is a symptom of the very deep splintering in the Democratic Party. Like, that's the reason that they weren't able to select anybody except for settle for Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. And, the Democratic establishment is powerful. And we saw Mayor Pete, we saw Amy Klobuchar, all of these people sort of coalesce around Biden at the last possible minute. That's where we are. And the debate last night, I was just sad watching it because it's just a pathetic performance, I think, from the heads of both of our major parties right now.
Right. Well, when you talk about, too, like why Trump got elected, why voters flocked to him, how he was able to sweep out that Republican primary field is insane when you really reflect on it. And then how he was able to get the Electoral College. I mean, it's crazy. And for the reasons that you mentioned, which is absolutely why he was able to get elected, the way that he handled political correctness, the way that he handled the media, I mean, all of that was just so what the American people wanted in that moment in 2016.
Yeah. He knew it. He has this like intuition that people who are sort of isolated in their Washington bubbles do not.
Right. Well, and when you look at the climate in 2016, both in the culture, in media, in Hollywood, all of that, and you look at it now, it's like, it's everything that it was in 2016 times a million. Mm-hmm. And they've really played into Trump's hand by confirming everything that he ran on and everything that he fought against in 2016. And now it's like they're coming at him with a vengeance and he can just kind of ramp up all of the same points. Think one policy issue. I mean, for instance, the transgender movement, mm-hmm. the way that it's moved in the last 4 years is staggering. Yes. The amount of ground that it's,
even just year to year.
Right. And so, that's something that the American people would jump on board with Trump in 2016.
Yep.
And now you look at
it. Trump was like pro Caitlyn Jenner, and you can use any restroom at Trump Tower in 15 and 16. But
that sort of issue.
Yes.
And now you look at it, and it's like the media and Hollywood and all of these major institutions, save for maybe some churches, and mm-hmm. It's a very small sliver of American institutions that has not absolutely proved everything that he said in 2016 true.
Yeah, and so this is what I'm talking about in terms of policy. Camille Paglia in 2016 said she knew that that Clinton was going to lose when the Obama administration released its Title IX directive on gender identity. And that has always really resonated with me. Of course, my job is culture editor, so that tends to be more what I'm interested in anyway. But that has always really resonated with me because although Trump is the most pro-LGBT Republican, but also the most pro-LGBT president when he was elected, than I think anybody else in modern American history, he sort of is that symbol, right? Like, this is so much larger than anybody's policy. Mm-hmm. Policy mm-hmm. issue or mm-hmm. policy stances. He's a symbol of somebody who eschews political correctness and doesn't just argue against the excesses of the radical left, correctly identifying the excesses of the radical left. He's also somebody who's just boldly against the radical left. Like, he's not afraid to talk about it like most Republicans have always been. He's not afraid to call out the media. He relishes it, absolutely relishes it. And that's a huge thing to understand about Donald Trump. And I actually don't think we saw a lot of that version of Trump last night. I think it came across as a very petty debate.
Yes, I agree. But it's really interesting to see how the American people respond to the way that Joe Biden and Donald Trump talk to them, and the way that Joe Biden and Donald Trump talk to them. During the debate last night, there were a couple of instances where, Trump would be trying to bring up Hunter Biden, and Biden would turn away from Trump and look at the camera and do one of these. And it was like, this isn't about our families. This is about the American people. This is about, you and me, and trying to deflect away from things that make him look like a swampy establishment Democrat, and trying to relate to the American people in a way that he has no right to relate to them, really. And then meanwhile, you have, Donald Trump at his rallies, one of his favorite lines to say is, they're coming for me because I'm fighting for you, or something to that effect.
And you were at a rally recently.
Yeah, it's a great line. And
did he say that at the Wisconsin rally?
He did. Yep. And I've heard him say it, many times before. It's one of his favorite points, but he's absolutely right. And I think when Americans outside the Beltway who just feel disenfranchised, who feel like they can't put, a Trump flag in their front yard because somebody might vandalize their house or steal their Trump sign or something, who are afraid that they might lose their job or lose out on other opportunities for supporting Trump, when they hear Biden, deflecting away from his swampiness, and then they hear Trump say something like that to them, it's like, who makes them feel more seen? And it's interesting, just like how they each try to relate and what resonates and what doesn't.
Yeah, and this is a conversation in the context we've been having for the last few minutes about those Obama Trump voters. But that's just not even, like, that gets me back to the Republican primary in 15 and 16. And Tim Carney's book, Alienated America, is really the best explanation. And it's the correct lens through which you should see all of this. But this election in particular, 2020, this is an election about the suburbs, and this is an election about base turnout, not necessarily about persuading all of these new voters. It's about, what are you going to do with these suburban voters, and how are you appealing to these suburban voters? Is the Republican struggle in the Trump era with suburban voters going to be resolved by the fact that you have Antifa, claiming territory in major American cities, and rioting and looting, basically all summer, and not just in these left-wing enclaves like Portland and Washington, D.C., but in Kenosha, in Louisville, in Lancaster. This is, so the dynamics of this election are sort of mind-numbingly complicated. And I don't think the debate, if anything, I think that debate last night, like, the real impact of it is just making people stay home.
Right. I agree. And we'll know the effect of all this violence in the cities after the election. I don't think there's a way to know how much that's weighing on people. But at the end of the day, you can talk about healthcare, you can talk about the military. There's a lot of things that you can talk about that can be on the ballot in 2020, but at the end of the day, if people in the suburbs are afraid of what their kids are learning in school, and they fear for their safety because things are bleeding out of the cities and into the suburbs, that has got to move to the top of the ticket as far as what is on people's minds when they vote.
Trump hammered the socialism angle really intensely last night, and the Republican Party was prepared to run against people that weren't Joe Biden. They were prepared to run against Kamala Harris. They were prepared to run, who didn't even make it to Iowa. They were prepared to run against Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and some of these other figures, which is basically, as soon as you come out in favor of Medicare for all, it's pretty easy to brand you as a legitimate socialist. And the reason that Republicans were thirsty for that opportunity is because they were doing focus groups. And Ronna McDaniel told me this in an interview last September, so just a little bit over a year ago, and it's still on our website. You can go check it out, that they were in focus groups. What was really moving educated suburban women was the socialism attack on Democrats. That is what was bringing people to Trump. And so that's why you heard him latching on heavily to the socialism line. I'm not sure how well it sticks when the candidate is Joe Biden.
Right. But he did talk about Bernie a lot last night. Like, Bernie's name came up a disproportionate amount when Trump was attacking Biden with, you're just like Bernie.
Biden's website said that he supports the Green New Deal when Biden said he didn't support the Green New Deal during the debate. And Biden, by the way, according to a McClatchy analysis that was done late last year, his platform was more radical than Hillary Clinton's in 2016. And so I am fully sympathetic with the leftists who are frustrated with Biden's Beltway credentials. And they say, this guy, but there's a huge difference between the cultural left and the economic left. And Biden is radical on cultural issues. For instance, he supports the Equality Act, which would completely thrust a lot of public institutions into chaos by blending biological sex with blurring the legal distinction between biological sex and gender identity. That's a big deal. It might not sound like it. It has a very innocuous name, but that's a very big deal. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there are ways to make Joe Biden out to be a radical. I just don't think anything's sticking to him so far, because I think this election it's just not very substantive.
Well, and I think Trump tried to do this last night when he was, throwing out attacks at Biden and trying to, call out every time he was either alienating the far left or alienating the moderates.
That I thought was really strong.
It was really strong, but it also didn't really, it was like Trump was interrupting every time that Biden would have shown his hand. And so it was like, it was a good tactic, but also, Trump needs to keep doing that when it's warranted. But also we just need to see in future debates, better questions that really get to the heart of where Biden is on these issues, because we still don't really know on a lot of them. His website says one thing, as he's campaigning, he's kind of flip-flopping. He's moving on issues all of the time. You can even see it. I mean, during the debate last night in real time, he gets asked a question and he's trying to kind of like not answer it and step very carefully so that he's not alienating anybody in his super fractured party. And so Trump needs to continue that tactic, but just take a step back so that we can actually hear Biden attempt to articulate it. Because then I think his attacks on, you're alienating the far left or you're alienating the moderates will be a lot stronger, because it will have come on the heels of Biden actually saying what he thinks.
Interesting. I mean, do you think there will be more debates? Because after last night, I lean against that. I think both candidates will just say this was BS and it's not worth doing, because the risks in this sort of listen, we were all freaked out in 2015 when Donald Trump just decided, this was actually early 2016, when Trump just decided not to show up for a debate. And everyone was freaked out that the norms were all going to be shattered and whatever. Listen, the norms are shattered. And so they don't have to do another debate. And I feel like the risks outweigh the benefits for both candidate, especially in the era of social media when Trump essentially has full control over his messaging with what he does on Twitter, to the extent that he can. The media is always going to media. And for Biden, it's all he has to do is smile, right? And that's the way that Biden sort of coasts to what he wants to be a victory. So I expect that there won't be further debates. I know that's kind of a crazy position, but that's my expectation.
I hadn't really considered that after last night's debate, but
that's all I was considering the whole debate is please do not let this happen again.
Us do this again. No, but as I'm considering it, I think that either candidate would have a pretty, strong position for why it's a good thing that they're not debating again. For Biden, it would be building off of what he said in the debate, I'm not debating this clown again, essentially. And for Trump, it would be about media bias, it would be about, this is a waste, Biden's going to lie and nobody's going to check him on it. We'll just do what we did in 2016, rah, rah. So I think it could be fine. I don't think either one looks necessarily weak by saying, I don't want to debate again. Even though, that could very well be the case, but I think it could be good optics, even if they opt not to debate.
Yeah, right. And I think, what will determine this is the decision-making process. So if one of them's able to make the other look like a coward for not debating, that's kind of a different situation, right? So if one of them says no, I'm not doing any other debates, then Trump or Biden is, this guy's afraid of talking to me because he got his butt kicked so badly the last time. So we'll see how that plays out.
And I think based on their personalities, it would be easier for Trump to hold Biden's feet to the fire and say that he's a coward for not debating than for Biden to do that to Trump, particularly after Trump did walk and then became the president.
Right. So Kylie and I mentioned Alienated America before, which is a really good look at how you can kind of the best prism through which we can view the Trump victory and take over the Republican Party is the Republican primary in 2016, and how you can look at the communities that were for Ted Cruz or other candidates, and they tended to be more cohesive communities. They tended to be stronger communities with civic institutions that were very much intact. Mormon communities, or Dutch communities in Wisconsin, as Tim wrote about, and then the communities that went in the Republican primary for Donald Trump tended to be places where the civic institutions, unfortunately, were crumbling. Low church participation, bowling alone, as the phrase goes. And Kylie and I are both from Wisconsin, and there are parts of Wisconsin that are fascinating, right? Like these Obama districts, Dem districts for years and years and years. Like I think it's the 7th district in Wisconsin, the northern part, a huge district, was represented by a Democrat for years until it flipped in the Tea Party in 2010 and went hard for Donald Trump in 2016. And there are places in Minnesota like this. There are sort of patches all over the country that are like this. Kylie, you're from a pretty rural area. What was I'm actually really curious. I don't think I've ever talked to you about this before. You were actually in Wisconsin in 15 and 16.
Right.
What were you observing?
I think in 2015, 2016, I was a little less plugged into politics and didn't, particularly in the Republican primary.
Kylie's a child.
I'm very young.
I learned that this week.
Actually, in 2015, 2016, I was in southern Wisconsin, so I was less in rural Wisconsin.
It's still fairly rural, but
more or less, yeah, but a little more influence from Madison and Milwaukee, a little
suburb
less
of Janesville,
a little less coming.
You were Watertown?
I was in Watertown.
Oh, that's very rural.
So that's pretty rural, but you have like all of everything around you. I was like doing an internship in Madison, it was all like I was spending half my time in Madison and Milwaukee. So
Madison's basically Manhattan.
Yeah, indistinguishable, really.
Right.
But in my hometown, I mean, we're looking at 5,000-6,000 people.
Yep.
Very, very, very red. And you mentioned the Mosinee area, the 7th district.
Well, that's where Kylie went to a Trump rally recently.
Which is,
the fact that the sitting president is holding a rally in Mosinee, Wisconsin, to people in Wisconsin is sort of mind-blowing. Very rural area.
Right. Although he did it in 2000. Where did he hold a rally there? That was the second rally.
He goes to rural areas.
Yep. And it's very strategic, obviously. And it's so funny to listen to just the fervent Trump support. People are not hesitantly Trump voting. Yeah. And I think that was obviously the case in 2016. Yeah. After Trump cleared the primary field, I think a lot of Republicans were left wondering, what the heck do we do? And who is this guy? And can we vote for him? And many didn't.
Yeah.
And now it seems that, Republicans they're voting for Trump and they're excited about voting for Trump and they're ready to.
Yeah.
And that's just a really big change from what I saw in 2016.
Right. And what people in DC continue to not understand, though they've had years to figure it out at this point, is that this is a base that is actually not motivated by racism and bigotry and misogyny, as a lot of the media still insists. Are there racists and bigots and misogynists who support Donald Trump? Presumably. But the Trump base is people who, and I'm talking about the base. I'm not talking about the Republican base or the conservative base. I'm talking about the Trump base. The Trump base is people who hate the establishment, and the establishment is the media, it's Hollywood, and that's also another thing a lot of people in DC don't understand, is that Hollywood is wrapped up in all of this. Josh Hawley is one of those few people that really understood this when he was campaigning, and I was covering it in 2018. He talked about the trifecta of Hollywood, Washington, and Wall Street. He would go out on the stump, and his stump speech included that several times. Hollywood, Washington, and Wall Street. This is what people don't understand about the Trump base. And it's just people who are fed up. They might not have specific policy proposals or demands. They don't want to. They just want, Jeb Bush called Donald Trump the chaos candidate, predicted that he would be a chaos president. I think that's what people wanted, right? They wanted chaos in Washington,
right?
Because they figured it would sort of shake up the establishment and maybe flush some of the corrupt elements of it out.
Right. And I mean, Joe Biden is the face of the establishment right now.
He really is.
And the way that Trump talks to his base about Joe Biden is the way that Trump's base talks to Trump's base about Joe Biden.
Yeah.
It was interesting to be at the Trump rally recently. And just listen, the way that he talks at a Trump rally is unlike any other way that he talks. It's really a different kind of communication to his base that's way more excited. It's just like, it's way more off the cuff and comical and just really brash and fun. And it was so funny to listen to Trump talk about Joe Biden in the way that he slams all establishment, Democrats, media, Washington, Wall Street, Hollywood, whatever. And to listen to the buzz around me of his base when he would make a jab at Joe Biden, and they're all saying the same things to each other, like, elbowing each other as if that's what they had just posted on Facebook or said to their, buddy, whatever. And so it's really resonating. It really works. And Joe Biden is the perfect punching bag for establishment.
To sort of bring things full circle here, that point feeds into what I think is the most important takeaway and the saddest element of this entire conversation, which is that what we saw, I think, was pathetic last night. People can disagree. I thought it was pathetic, a pathetic display. You can blame whoever you want. But what we're not talking about, we were talking about it a little bit this summer, but the media does such a terrible job of hosting and guiding these conversations. What we're really not talking about is the cultural decay that has produced the chaos in this country and has led to both of these candidates receiving their respective parties' nominations. And that means, there are communities that are suffering. There is the decline of religiosity. There is the failures of Wall Street, people who never recovered from the recession, people who right now are struggling deeply because of restrictions due to the pandemic and due to government overreach in their states. But really, this is the millennial generation, which is now, I believe, the largest voting bloc, or is up there. And it really is struggling. They're out in the streets, of course, because of their own choices in some of these cases, but also because they grew up in this malaise, and because this is a culture that is so corrupted by sin and corrupted by greed, and that's always true of culture at pretty much any given moment in history. But what we're seeing right now is more serious. I think everybody instinctively understands that. And last night was a symptom of that, but it offered absolutely no solution.
Right. Well, and I mean, it's really a very clear convergence of the breakdown of needed institutions.
Families.
Right. Being replaced by really crappy institutions.
Yeah.
People are looking to politics and to social causes to fill the void that's left by the breakdown of the American family and the, neglect of church and
social media.
Social media is
chemical
huge.
Addictions that big tech has purposefully designed.
Right. And so it's like all of these things just converge, and people are searching for something to unite them and to get behind. And in so doing, they're just continuing to chip away at these institutions. Same thing with, revisionist history is another one. Kids are being taught these things in schools, that it's good and it's okay to tear down these institutions. And then here we are, we're reaping the consequences of that.
Right. I'm much more interested in having a conversation about the rapid acceleration of technology, about the rapid disintegration of the nuclear family, about the greed of Wall Street and the way that sort of trickles down in a crippling way to the middle class, about there's literally so much to talk about,
right.
But about religion, about all of these things. And that's, we can't expect our politics to be pristine and to serve us well at any given moment, right, because public servants are all flawed. But this was, I think, especially far from it.
But if you want to understand how we got here, you just have to look at the breakdown of those institutions.
Yeah.
I mean, it's easy when there's an instance of something, a racial incident. It's really easy to just take to the streets and, under the banner of Black Lives Matter, this is the cause we support, and, this is how we're going to fix it. Well, let's talk about in those communities, what happened to families, you know,
Yeah.
in the last X number of years? What happened
Well,
to churches? What happened to schools? And I think that paints a pretty clear picture of how we got where we are and where we're headed if we don't restore them.
right, absolutely. I mean, rapid acceleration of big tech, the rapid disintegration of the family, the academy, the oh gosh, it is really sad to think about on my end, because we just have seen, I mean, the changing economy and the way that's impacted not just people's financial situations, definitely people's financial situations, but also the way they live their everyday lives, having, you know, a company that they could be proud to work for, going to a steady job. I'll even say a union job in some cases, where some of those jobs serve people very well. Some, of course, did not. And we also didn't even talk about opioids. We didn't talk about any of that stuff. And it's just rare that we hear these conversations discussed honestly in the media and by the political class, because so many of them are completely divorced from the failures. Carney talks about this in his book. It's called the Lena Dunham fallacy, something to that extent, about how the elites actually live traditionalist lives in terms of marriage and kids and education, the very lives that they denigrate with their powerful megaphones to the rest of the country, and the rest of the country is what suffers. So this is why the political class doesn't have these conversations, because the political class is divorced from the reality, and it's really leading to an incredibly unproductive situation.
Well, and what you believe about those institutions and about, you know, American culture as a whole will really largely determine who you're voting for in November. I mean, it's like they've clearly, well, Biden hasn't clearly really said a lot of parts of his platform, but the Democrats have made very clear how they feel about these key institutions of American life, and so have Republicans. And, you know, that's what's really on the ballot in November.
Well, and you know, Kylie, again, this brings it full circle, but it's also, it's not just what people will vote for, it's what people just won't vote at all about, right? So it's, and I think there's going to be just a lot of disillusioned voters who aren't buying either party's spin that, you know, they need to get out. And I just think people are checking out because things seem so miserable. Of course, that means the bases are probably more engaged, but I'm particularly concerned about the people that are disenchanted to the point of total pessimism, and I understand it, and I wish more people, I wish this was a larger part of our conversation.
People are burned out, and, you know, there's no saying what can happen in the next 40 days or however many we're down to. You know, just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, it has. And whatever happens between now and November 3rd, I think will just continue to potentially you know, make people more disillusioned and less likely to vote.
Right, and there's no saying what happens when we have problems with counting ballots, especially in an era of intense institutional distrust. And you know, there's no saying, and this is something the left should understand, if somebody like Bernie Sanders triumphs over somebody like Joe Biden at some point, whether that's electorally or culturally, they, you know, might not be particularly happy with the results if the political class doesn't address some of the cultural decay that they absolutely need to. Kylie, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Emily.
I'm Emily Jashinsky. I have a cough. I don't actually. I'm Emily Jashinsky. My colleague is Kylee Zempel, assistant editor at the Federalist. We'll be back soon with more. Subscribe on YouTube, and until we're back, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.